Hello, everybody. My name is Moxie with Squibbler, and welcome to your weekly webinar. Last week, we focused on nonfiction and research. So this week, we're going to help those of you that are working on in dialogue on your projects. And that could be nonfiction as well. It's also very helpful for fiction and for screenplay writing. So we'll be talking about creating compelling dialogue that will elevate your script or novel. So in this webinar, you're going to learn the importance of including good dialogue in your script or novel, or perhaps if you're writing creative nonfiction as well. We'll look at some tips from the pros for elevating your dialogue. We have quite a few professional guidelines for you. And then we'll also have some tips from Squibbler on improving your dialogue as well, and how you can use our AI to improve your dialogue. So there's a reason that dialogue is important to humans when we're listening to stories. We've always been engaged in the act of storytelling, and that's from the dawn of time when we were sitting around the fire with our tribes centuries ago, or now if we're watching a summer blockbuster in the theater. We like to see how humans interact with each other and how they behave with each other. And one of the key ways we find ourselves immersed in a story is with the ways characters talk to one another, and that is dialogue. So to someone like Neil Gaiman, who's the author of Sandman and Coraline, he says dialogue is character. And what he means here segues with the old adage about writing fiction: show and don't tell. So dialogue can be one ways to do that. You're going to be showing and not telling what your characters think. So let's take a look at an example. I just wrote these, to show you the difference between the two. Seated across from her estranged husband, Marie felt sad. So that's where we're telling how she feels. Compare that with the inclusion of dialogue. Adam looked at his watch and avoided Marie's gaze. "I don't know," Marie said at last. "I just thought we'd be different. I always thought we'd make it. I really did." So that's very different. You can tell that where the one is explaining that she's sad, then the second one, we are able to infer that with the dialogue that she's using. When dialogue goes wrong, the reader or viewer gets pulled out of the magic of a scene. And so that's another reason dialogue is important. And worse, the results can lead to something like the Razzies, and you don't want to win one of those. It's the opposite of the Oscars, or to universal mocking. Probably one of the most infamous examples is from Tommy Wiseau's film The Room, which has been widely mocked. And we'll just kind of take a look at it. You have Johnny and Mark here on the script talking to each other. And Mark talks about a story where he knew a girl who had about a dozen guys. One of them beat her up, and she ended up in the hospital. And Johnny says, "What a story." Mark says, "You could say that again." Johnny says, "I'm so lucky to have you as my best friend, and I love Lisa so much." That's not natural dialogue. This is not how people talk or go through conversations. Mark says, "Yeah, man, you are lucky, very lucky." And then Johnny says, "You should have a girl, Mark." None of this is how we would talk to people in situations, which is not to say that dialogue has to be spot on or ultra realistic. But this is so unrealistic that it's something that's held up as a standard for things not to do in your writing versus something you should do. So here are some tips from the pros. We've looked at something not to do. We'll take a look at some things that professional writers do and advice that they have for you about dialogue. Margaret Atwood, who's written The Handmaid's Tale and The Robber's Bride, says don't use any extraneous dialogue. She said that any dialogue that's in a novel or a script should have a purpose. So she suggests cutting out any unnecessary dialogue you might have in there. And in his book on horror, Writing in the Dark, Tim Wagner agrees. He says that too much dialogue can actually be telling and not showing. So you have to strike a balance between those. Another example is from James Patterson, who wrote Kiss the Girls and First to Die. He says to make sure that your dialogue is moving your story forward. And he's well known for having page turners where people want to keep reading. He says that dialogue should move your story forward and reveal things about the characters. And like Atwood and Wagner, he also suggests cutting out any dialogue that don't meet those two rules of his. If they're not moving the story forward, they're not revealing things about characters, they're just fluff, and you need to cut them out. David Baldacci, who wrote Absolute Power, says not to rely solely on dialogue for developing your characters. And this is really good advice. He advises coupling your dialogue with good descriptions and interior monologue, where your character might be thinking about something. You can accomplish both of these in Squibbler's Smart Writer, by the way, by using the Describe feature or the More Inner Conflict feature under the Rewrite function. David Baldacci also suggests that you make sure you know what the emotions are going to be in a scene before you write a scene with dialogue. So, how do these characters feel? Their language should mirror their emotions. In other words, the words that they choose, the syntax they're using is all going to reflect how they feel in that scene. He also advises that you should know shorthand and jargon that different occupations use in your novel. So, for example, if you're writing a crime novel and you have police characters, what are some of the terms and phrases that they're going to use specific to them and their dialogue? This is also important for scripts, I'd like to point out. Salman Rushdie, who wrote Midnight's Children, says that thinking about how your character is reflected in their dialogue is important to do before you write. In other words, if your character is shy, what about their syntax of their sentences might reveal this? If a character is a politician, how might their dialogue reveal their political ambitions? What words are they going to use? What they're going to be trying to convince someone? So the way that they speak is going to be very different from someone who is shy. Rushdie and other successful novelists and screenwriters also suggest observing how people speak. Writers should be good observers and develop an ear for how speech patterns work. You can even record your own conversations with people to get an idea of speech patterns, but just remember, if you do this, to get permission first. You don't want to record people without their knowledge. And be careful how you explain things through dialogue, warns Alan Moore, who wrote V for Vendetta and The Watchmen. He says that expository dialogue, where explaining things, should not sound expository, and David Baldacci mentions this as well. Never have a character say, "as you know." Don't write throwaway lines like this. Everything should be continuous, resonant dialogue, and you should not feel as if, as a reader, you're being explained to. It should fit into your dialogue very well. You should have variety in your dialogue. If I'm reading a book, I should be able to identify a character by their dialogue without even looking to see who is saying the phrase. Moore says that each character you write should sound different from all the others. So watch for that. Make sure your characters don't all sound the same. You want to make sure your dialogue is consistent for your characters too. So if you have a character speaking in a Boston accent or dialect, or a Mandarin dialect, they should speak this way throughout your work. You don't want to drop it halfway through and confuse your readers. UK crime writer Alexander McCall Smith, who wrote the #1 ladies detective agency, also has several rules for writing successful dialogue. He says dialogue should flesh out characters, and you can't just write what you think people say. If you're too realistic with the dialogue, it's going to be boring. So books are not 100% realistic in the way that they express dialogue. Sometimes it's going to be unrealistic to make characters more interesting. For example, during the course of this webinar, I've probably said a couple of times. You wouldn't include that in your book or your screenplay because it just doesn't make sense to include fillers like that. Dialogue should glow. Characters should have characteristics in their speech, right? We should know who it is. McCall Smith also says a lot of dialogue is too lengthy. It needs to be broken up. So have a character look around or something, or break up, a longer speech or something with another character interrupting them or something happening, so your reader doesn't get bogged down with too much dialogue. You can also use Scribbler's rewrite function and ask it to shorten some of those sections if you feel your dialogue is too long. Anna Kent, the one who wrote The One That Got Away and I Know You, has several tips on dialogue as well. And these are good questions to ask yourself in the editing phase too. Is your dialogue realistic? Does it sound real? Is it realistic for the person who is speaking? And that means your character. Would this character actually say these things? Beware that the speech does not sound like you. We are the creators of our worlds that we're writing, but you want to make sure that all the characters don't sound exactly like the way you would talk. Anna Kent also suggests keeping a bit of vocabulary for each of your characters. You could put those in the summary section of your writing in Scribbler on the editor. And then for each character, you'll have a little bit of dialogue that you can keep for them specifically. So those are some tips from the pros. And now we're going to take a look at some additional advice. And I'll try to tie in some things that you can do with Scribbler to heighten your dialogue and make it more exemplary. One thing that's very important if you're writing historical fiction is you need to make sure you're faithful to the period. If you're writing a crime novel set in England in the 1800s, make sure you research the language your characters would use in the period. There are a lot of free websites that list period slang, outfits, costumes, clothing, maps. You can get books on items people would use in certain time periods and cultures. So make sure you have all those things at your disposal if you're going to write dialogue in a different time period. What's going to happen when you do this is that your readers are going to appreciate the little details that you're including. They're going to find your dialogue more believable if you're including period language. On the other hand, if you goof up and you use phrases that would not make sense in, say, Victorian England, your savvier readers who know the period are going to be turned off by these mistakes, and they may even put your book down and never finish it. So be careful with that. Another thing to do, this is a well-known practice, is to practice saying your dialogue aloud. This is an old tip, so I'm not crediting to one pro or to myself. It's something you've probably heard before. But reading your dialogue aloud or having a group of friends engaged in a table reading of your script, even if they're not actors, can help you pinpoint parts that sound unnatural or forced. When my first play was produced, it was really humbling to hear these excellent professional actors stumble over lines that I thought worked on paper. They seemed really good on paper, but it was difficult. Some of them were difficult for the actors to say. So what I did was edit those lines that were difficult for them with their feedback, and it made it for a much better play that way. You also wanted to read the masters. It's always a good idea to see how the masters of dialogue perfect their art. You can, of course, Google to see who are the best writers in dialogue and look for that. But some writers I suggest who have mastered this skill are Toni Morrison, James Lee Burke, James Joyce, and Haruki Murakami. These are all excellent at dialogue. You also want to look up writers who are known for their dialogue in the genre you're planning to write. To see what they're doing. So if you're writing scripts, you want to look scripts that are in the same genre. Like if it's an action script, look at some of the best action dialogue. If you're writing a romance novel, you want to look at some of the best dialogue in romance novels that you know of. And this will help you too. Another tip is to make sure you know your characters. You want to understand your characters' backgrounds, motivations, and personalities. This isn't really something you can wing in a larger body of work, because by the time you get to page 40, your page 50, 60, 70, you're going to start to perhaps forget some of what happened before. So authentic dialogue is going to come from knowing how your characters think and feel and speak. Their unique voices should reflect their individual experiences and traits. So if you need to keep track of something like this, it's a good idea to keep a journal with your characters listed. And we even have a free worksheet for you under the resource channel on Scribbler's Discord server. So that's another place to look. You can fill out these character worksheets and then look at those as you're writing. One other thing to help you ace your dialogue is to use subtext. Dialogue is not always what's said. It's often about what is not said as well. People don't always exactly say what they mean. We have hidden motives. So sometimes the real message is hidden beneath the surface. This is called the iceberg method of writing dialogue, and it generates interest and suspense. So it's something you're going to see a lot in thrillers, in crime, and drama, right? In the same way, you could use subtext to add layers to your dialogue. So what's not being said is as important as what's on the page. Another tip is to keep it concise. As Queen Gertrude says in Hamlet when she's talking to the very wordy Polonius, more matter with less art. If you're overloading your dialogue with unnecessary words, it's going to frustrate your reader. So great dialogue is sharp and to the point. Every line should serve a purpose, whether it's advancing the plot, revealing a character, or building tension. You also want to show and not tell with your dialogue. And this applies to novels, plays, screenplays, and I imagine creative nonfiction as well. You want to use dialogue to reveal your character traits and emotions indirectly. We took a look at this earlier with that example of Marie and her estranged husband and her feeling sad versus what she says. Instead of telling your reader how the viewer or a character feels, show it in their speech patterns, in their word choices and reactions. You can also use Scribbler's SmartWriter to revise those areas that tell too much. You can click on Rewrite when you're ready to revise, and then Show Not Tell option. You want to capture realistic speech patterns. Listen to how people actually talk, but be careful not to replicate it verbatim. And that's something that Alexander McCall Smith has said from the prose. Real life conversation is often full of filler. lots of ums and I think and well, maybe. But in fiction, and especially on screen, where every minute is being, it costs money, every line should feel intentional. So aim for a balance between realism and clarity. See what you can cut out. You also want to vary your sentence length and structure. Mix up short and long sentences to create rhythm and to keep the dialogue dynamic. This variation is going to help reflect different moods, from calm reflection to rapid fire tension. So, what you can do is observe how people speak when they're tired. They tend to just sort of draw out words and yawn. How do people speak when they're angry? How do they speak when they're sad? And how do they speak when they're happy? Someone wins the lottery or something, they're going to speak very quickly. They're going to be very happy about it. One other tip is that characters should not state the obvious or blatantly express their emotions or intentions. You see this a lot in older films with the villains, capturing the hero and then explaining what their intentions or their crimes are going to be. And books and films just don't do this anymore for good reason. We want to let readers and viewers infer deeper meaning. This is going to create more engaging and thought-provoking dialogue for your readers or viewers. You also want to use dialogue to create conflict. Conflict is often going to drive drama, which is going to drive your plot. So they're all connected. So you can use dialogue to create or escalate conflict between characters. This can be through disagreements, through misunderstandings, differing goals, or perspectives. For those of you that are romance writers, differing goals is a big one. You'll see that a lot in romance. You can also use the Smart Writers Rewrite More Intense function to heighten the tension in your dialogue once you've got it set down. Another tip is to revise ruthlessly. There's a famous phrase in writing, and that is kill your darlings. Sometimes you're going to have to let go of things that you've written that you feel are very, very good, but they're ultimately bogging down your novel, your story, your screenplay. Dialogue is often going to improve with revision. So cut out redundant lines. See if someone's saying the same thing. Sharpen your wording and ensure that every piece of dialogue moves the story forward or deepens character development. One thing that I try to make sure I'm doing is not using characters' names too much, because we just don't say each other's names in conversation that often. So that's one thing to look for as well. So in this webinar, we have reviewed the importance of including good dialogue in your script or novel. We've given you some tips for elevating your dialogue, and we had some tips from the pros, and we had some tips on improving your dialogue from Scribbler and how you can use our AI to improve your dialogue. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks for being here, and we'll return next week with a new webinar as well. Bye. Thank you.